Okay, well, good morning. Those of you here and those who are watching online. I'm Kevin Gover. I'm the director of the National Museum of the American Indian. We're here today to talk about our National Native American Veterans Memorial. It's a rainy day in Washington, and so we don't have a large group assembled, but maybe a few people will show up along the way. In the meantime, I'll give you a briefing on where we are with the memorial. Thanks. So, okay, how we doing? Okay, we've been holding these meetings for the last 18 months. We have been to most parts of the country. We have only a handful of these left to do, but I wanted to go over what we've been presenting to Native veterans across the country and give you a little insight on what we think we're learning. So, well, there we go. Among Native Americans, it's well known that Natives serve in the U.S. Armed Forces in every major conflict since the Revolution. And through the 20th century, they served in greater numbers per capita than any other segment of the population. Here, for example, is Master Sergeant Woodrow Wilson Keeble. He was both a World War II veteran and a veteran of the Korean War. Over time, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Combat Infantryman Badge. In 2007, his Distinguished Service Cross was posthumously upgraded to the Medal of Honor for his bravery during the Korean War. And Master Sergeant Keeble was from the Sisseton-Wahpeton Reservation in North and South Dakota. During World War II, over 44,000 American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians served in the military. Hundreds of them were code talkers from approximately 30 tribes. 44,000 is not a huge number to our eye, but at the time there were only 330,000 American Indians living. And so this was an extraordinary percentage of the service age young men that did end up serving in World War II. Today, the DoD estimates there are 31,000 Native Americans on active duty. More than 140,000 veterans self-identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. This is Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Lowry, who was Maidu, Washoe, and Modoc. He was one of the most decorated Native Americans to serve in World War II. He served in Korea as well, and during his career earned a Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 5 Purple Hearts, a Legion of Merit, and a World War II Victory Medal. Here are 3 Native Hawaiian Medal of Honor recipients. Captain Francis Brown Y, PFC Herbert Kaileha, and PFC Anthony Thomas. All were honored for conspicuous gallantry during World War II and Korea. There are Native American veterans in every state in the Union. These numbers seem a little low to me, but I think they probably are representative of the allocation of Native American veterans across the country. 2 more veterans. On the left is Ferd Clark, who's an Anacoke Indian who served in World War I. And on the right is Donna Loring, a Penobscot who served as a communication specialist in Vietnam and was the Penobscot's police chief during the 1980s. So, like I said, this history is quite well known in Indian country, but not so much among the non-Indian population. So Congress, some time ago, authorized the establishment of a National Native American Veterans Memorial on the grounds of the National Museum of the American Indian to give all Americans the opportunity to learn of the proud and courageous tradition of service of Native Americans in the armed forces of the United States. Now, that legislation was amended a little less than 4 years ago and cleaned up some of the troubling provisions, the troublesome provisions that made it difficult to proceed with the memorial. So since those amendments were passed, we have been moving to fulfill this charge from the U.S. Congress. The memorial will be on our grounds here in Washington. We are located, for those of you who don't know, between the Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, and the United States Capitol. One other piece of the puzzle is that we cannot use federal funds to develop the memorial. That is true for all memorials on the National Mall, and so we will have to raise the funds to develop this memorial. This chart, which may be difficult to see, especially online, but this chart shows the number of the most visited memorials in Washington in 2015. First among these is the Lincoln Memorial with nearly 8 million visitors. Second is the Vietnam Memorial with 5.6 million, the World War II Memorial with over 5 million, the Korean Memorial with over 4 million, the Martin Luther King at 3.5 million, and the Jefferson Memorial at 3.1. Our museum here in Washington receives about 1.4 million visitors a year. We anticipate that in addition to that 1.4, that we will get a lot of other visitors to visit this Native American Veterans Memorial. So here's a view of the National Mall. On the far right is Capitol Hill. On the left is the Potomac River. And in between there, at the foot of Capitol Hill, is the National Museum of the American Indian. So we're in a very prominent location on the National Mall. This is the view of the eastern face of the National Museum of the American Indian. And this is a depiction of our grounds. And so one of the questions we've been asking the veterans across the country is where on our grounds would they like for it to be located? And while initially we thought that these two spaces on the south side of the museum made the most sense. They're available, there's some open space there, and they can, there would be room for a nice memorial. We found that almost immediately the veterans that we've spoken to don't care for that. And they don't care for it because of Independence Avenue being right there, one of the busier streets in Washington, and the fact that cars would be able to park along this side, literally within a few feet of the memorial. They let us know that they wanted a place that allows for a more private experience, more reflective and more contemplative. So that led us to look then on the north side of the museum along this landscape area. That is informally landscaped to represent a hardwood forest. The nice feature about that is it's along what we call our river walk. And here is a water feature that flows from west to east and flows to the front of the museum. And the space was designed to create an experience where when the visitor enters the river walk, they get the feeling that they've left the city and entered a new space. And it's actually quite effective in doing that. There's a lot less traffic on this side, on the north side of the museum, and so it does allow for a more contemplative experience. The problem with that site is that this space is pretty narrow, and it would be very difficult to build something in there without removing large parts of the landscaping, which in turn would reduce sort of the insulated nature of the space. And so it would either be a very narrow, I guess, narrow and long memorial, or we would have to give up some of the landscaping and thereby affect really the quality of the experience. Now, there are other sites that might be considered. For example, this is our Welcome Plaza on the east side of the museum. It's a large, fairly open space, but it's also been designed to give the visitor a very specific experience upon entering the museum. And while the east side is always attractive because it's the east and because that's an important direction in most Native cultures, it still would be a challenge, we think, to create something that would fit into that space in a way that is consistent with the entry experience that we want visitors to have. Another space that's come up and is sort of gaining traction in my view is this amphitheater space. Now, it is accessible from the outside, but only on a little footbridge that we tend to keep closed. It would not be handicap accessible from the outside because those are, as you would guess, those are some stairs, and there's probably not room to build a suitable ramp. On the other hand, from inside the museum, the space can be entered readily by anyone, and it's larger than it looks because much of this area is overhang, and as we look at it, it turns out to be a pretty large space, wider than this and longer than either of these. So that's become an attractive proposition, and we'll see. Now, I would say we haven't ruled out any of the sites. It's certainly true, though, that because of the feedback we've gotten from the veterans, the South Side is going to be disfavored. And unless somebody could solve that problem, and I don't think they can, of ameliorating traffic noise and creating a more insular space there, it seems unlikely that it would meet the expectations of Native American veterans. And so that leaves us really with the sites on the north side of the museum, and we would expect that to be where the winning design will arise. We've not yet decided that we will specify the precise location in the document announcing and governing the design competition. Because we want to hold open the possibility that some brilliant designer will come up with a great idea for any of these spaces, and we will. So we're still pondering that, and we've not yet made a decision. So as I indicated, since January of 2016, we have been conducting consultation sessions with Native American veterans across the country. One of the first things we did was to appoint an advisory committee of Native American veterans, and the co-chairs of that committee are Ben Nighthorse Campbell, the former United States Senator and a Northern Cheyenne, and Chickasaw Nation Lieutenant Governor Jefferson Keel. They are the co-chairs. We have another 30 or so members from all across the country. The committee has representatives from all branches of the service. Both men and women are included, and Gold Star families are also represented on the advisory committee. One of those members is Micheline Bigman, who is the founder. She's an Army veteran and the founder of the Native American Women Warriors. And the Native American Women Warriors are fixtures on the Powwow Trail and are well known across Indian country. They were created to raise awareness about Native American women veterans and to provide support services for Native American women veterans. We intend to wrap up these consultations next month. By then, we will have visited all 12 regions of the country seeking input and support for the memorial. Here's a list which you won't be able to read from a distance, but it's a list of the places where we have held consultations. And as I say, it's really been in every part of the country. The only place we haven't been yet is the Pacific Northwest. We will be there next month, and then we will be in Alaska for 2 more sessions. The project has several elements beyond the literal memorial itself. Remember that the charge that the Congress gave us was to give all Americans the opportunity to learn of the courageous tradition of Native American service in the armed forces of the United States. That means we have to reach beyond the museum beyond the grounds of the museum and create opportunities, other opportunities for people to learn about this. One of the first things we did was to create a traveling banner exhibition. The exhibition was curated by Dr. Herman Viola. And Dr. Viola is the author of Warriors in Uniform, which is a National Geographic publication and probably the most comprehensive work so far on Native Americans and their service to the United States. And it was made possible by a grant from the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. Usually when we create a traveling banner exhibition, we'll make 1 or 2 copies. This one we made 5 because we anticipated that it would be highly subscribed, and we were right. And so the exhibition is traveling now and is fully subscribed for the rest of this year, but it is suitable to be put up almost in any open space within a building. It could be a conference room, it could be a lobby, tribal museums, libraries, tribal headquarters are all hosting these. We've even had it go up in a few casinos across the country. And so we expect this to continue to be very popular, so much so that we actually have been asked to create a 6th and a 7th copy of it in order to meet the demand. Our timeline is pretty aggressive. We hope to open the memorial on Veterans Day in 2020, a little more than 3 years from now. In order for that to happen, first we have to conduct a design competition. Under the terms of the statute, the design competition has to be open, that meaning anyone can submit a proposed design. We've decided to make it a blind competition as well, so that in the first round of the competition, the jury will not know who submitted any given proposal. And only after a set of finalists are selected will we know who the successful bidders or proposers are. If all goes well, sometime next summer of 2018, the jury will select a final design. And from that point on, the only thing that will stand between us and the construction and completion of the memorial will be to be able to raise the private funds needed to do so. The estimated budget for the project is $15 million. A little over half of that is for the actual construction of the memorial. And just take heed, that's an estimate. It's really a guess because we don't know what it will cost because we don't have a design, and we won't have a design for another year or so. In addition to that, one of the clear messages we've received and that we've taken to heart is that this is not a project that will be complete and then walked away from. This becomes a permanent project of the museum, if for no other reason than that there will continue to be Native Americans who serve in the armed forces of the United States, and the memorial and the associated projects have to reflect the new veterans who will come in future generations. So one of the things that is very important to us is that we create a website where people can really learn a lot about these veterans. As we've been going around the country, we've been talking to the tribes and asking them if they would be willing at some future date when we're ready to begin the work to give us a roster of all the veterans, all the veterans from their tribes. And almost everywhere they've said absolutely. In fact, at the New Mexico meeting earlier this week, there was a gentleman from, was he from Santo Domingo? No, it was Okayawingay. It was Okayawingay. And Okayawingay is developing its list and collecting their service records and taking oral histories from living veterans on the reservation. And so those are the kinds of resources that we're hoping will be made available to us in order to carry this off of creating as comprehensive a list of Native veterans as possible. And when I say comprehensive, I mean going back to the Revolution. And so it will be no small matter to take this on. In order to carry out that work, part of the project budget is to establish an endowment so that we can hire researchers and send them into the archives and into the DoD records to find the material we need to sort of round out who these veterans were and tell as much as we can know about them. There are other costs associated with it. For example, the cost of conducting these consultations has already been incurred. The costs of doing the design competition are yet to come. We expect as well to have a very sizable set of events for the dedication of the memorial in 2020. And we've had some interesting conversations. First of all, a lot of veterans would really like to come. And second, there are organizations and companies out there who would like to help make that happen. So last year, Southwest Airlines brought a group of veterans from Nevada, Native veterans from Nevada. And it was their first, I think their first all-Native honor flight, they call it. And so when we were in Reno, we met the company executives who do that project, and they're very excited to help us, perhaps setting up a set of honor flights when it's time to dedicate the memorial. Once we have the veterans here, we want to put on quite a show and attract as much attention to it as possible, all as part of the mission of educating as many Americans as possible. We've been talking to tribes across the country. We've asked them to do three things for us. One is to host the Patriot Nations banner exhibition. The second is to pass tribal resolutions in support of the memorial. And the reason for that is very simple. I've lived in Washington off and on quite a few years. And I've never seen a memorial project that did not at some point become controversial. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for really bad reasons, but they become controversial. And as a Smithsonian museum, we're really not in a position to fight some political fight with whoever might raise their hand. And so it's very important that we be able to say that Indian tribal governments and Native American veterans support this project because they do have clout and people will really care that they support it. And then finally, we have been out raising money on a very, what would you say, in a low-key way. We've raised over 10% of the project budget so far. I'd say we have another 20% well along in the pipeline, but we're going to need to ramp it up in order to construct the memorial. Here at the Smithsonian, we can't start building something unless we show we have the money to finish building it, and so that is probably the key impediment to completing the memorial. Is once we have that money in hand, there's very little that would prevent us from completing it. But until the money is in hand, we really can't start. So we will be asking for support, not only, by the way, from Indian tribes, but from companies, corporations, and of course from individuals across the country. And what we do know is there's a great deal of goodwill for Native American veterans. And very little opposition to the idea that there should be a memorial here in Washington on the grounds of the National Museum of the American Indian. Here are some of our donors so far. Our largest donor is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, but as you can see, we also have had support from companies like Bank of America and Northrop Grumman, tribes like San Manuel, and the Citizens Potawatomi in Oklahoma. And here are just some addresses, some basic addresses for how to be in touch with us about this. And so that's where we are. So let me spend a little time, though, talking about what we've seen. What we've seen in our consultation sessions, and what we've seen and heard, really. The veterans, as you would expect, are very thoughtful about their service and about how they would like to see that recognized and memorialized. They're not particularly interested in sort of a triumphal presentation of their heroic service. They want something more serious and contemplative. They want people to come away asking themselves, why is it that these people, who in so many cases and in so many ways were badly abused by the United States, nevertheless chose to serve in the armed forces of the United States? They're entirely aware of the poignancy of that, and they do have answers to that. The answers vary, of course, from person to person, but in some other ways, they're very consistent about the warrior's duty to protect the homeland. They want to see something that's truly national in scale. They want it to be intertribal. They want it to be intercultural. They want to see that all Native warriors are acknowledged in some way through cultural iconography, for example, or other representations, so that it wouldn't just be a Southwest motif or a Plains motif. They want to see it be broad and include everyone. They want all of the services represented. They want all eras of Native American service represented as well, beginning with the Revolution and continuing up to the global war on terrorism. They want to see both men and women acknowledged. And there's been some of the best conversation has been around that idea, and we're happy that a lot of Native American women veterans have been attending. They want to see Native spirituality acknowledged in some way. Of course, that's quite a design challenge to do that in a way that is appropriate and respectful. They want to see the families of those who serve be acknowledged, and so that the memorial somehow reflects the struggle and sacrifice on the home front of the family members of those who serve. It raises a lot of interesting challenges for the museum, because if you're familiar at all with the Vietnam Wall, people are always leaving things at the wall, and as their tribute, in a sense, to a particular veteran or to all veterans of the Vietnam War. We have to develop, the Park Service found itself in quite a dilemma, because at first they had been carefully collecting every single thing that was left at the wall, only to find themselves with a real problem of caring for all of that material and preserving it. They now are working on a set of guidelines for what they will collect going forward, and we'll be looking to them for some expertise on how we should think about this memorial. We also have issues around people wanting to, and they certainly will, and we want them to be able to do ceremonial blessings at the memorial site. It could be something very elaborate and very private that we would have to find a way to accommodate, or it may be something as simple as burning sage or sweetgrass at the memorial site, or leaving those things at the memorial. And we will have to develop policies and procedures for how we will gather that, and what is the appropriate way for us to deal with it. So there's a lot for us to think about in doing this. There are also issues, for example, they're very interested in some parts of the country in being able to leave tobacco ties at the memorial. Well, they need some place to hang those from, and so we have to think about that in looking at proposed designs and locations on the grounds. And so a lot of these things are going to be involved in how we finally evaluate the designs for the memorial. So it's probably as complex a project as the museum has undertaken since the opening of our two museums and the opening of our Cultural Resources Center. But it's a charge that we welcome very much. So with that, I'm going to ask Herman Viola if he would say a few words about Native veterans, about the memorial, and about what you've been seeing at these consultations. Got to come here.
Well, thank you, Kevin. And I want to just, again, my name is Herman Viola. I'm a curator emeritus at the Smithsonian, and that means I've been here a long time. Not Adam and Eve, but quite a while. So this has really been a fascinating journey, and Kevin hit the high points. This is going to be a living memorial, and we want to make sure that all Native peoples feel welcome, represented, included. And as he said, we've been going around the country collecting stories. Well, I've started collecting these stories actually about 35 years ago. My claim to fame is I started the first intern program for Indians at the Smithsonian when I was at the National Museum of Natural History. And so it was a program to help tribes set up archives, libraries, and to become historians for their communities. And when we started the program, there were no Indians anywhere on the staff. There wasn't even the thought of a Museum of the American Indian. So anyhow, I got some funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and we let each tribe pick one person who could come and be kind of a person who could come into the community. And I had been at the National Archives with the Bureau of Indian Affairs records. So anyhow, these folks showed up. Each tribe could pick one person, and we had a little money to fly them here, but they had no place to live, so I had to put them in my home, my neighbors' houses, and the program went on for about 10 years. And we had about 65 people from different tribes, but as you know about Indian country, they're so generous and so welcoming. So they lived in my house. Well, you have to come to my house. So I go to Navajo Reservation. I go to Pine Ridge. And I started hearing these stories that said, did you know Grandpa did this and whatever. And so suddenly I realized there were stories out there that no one had ever documented, and they were going to be lost. And I was an archivist. So I started recording some of those. Then Ben Whitehorse Campbell, who we just mentioned, called me up one day. And when a congressman calls you up at your office in this museum, you answer. And he said, I'd like to have lunch with you. I said, oh, well, okay. So I went over there. I had no idea what he wanted. And he said, I suppose you're curious to know why I called you. And I said, I am. He said, I want you to write my biography. Oh, I said, well, I was embarrassed. I said, how do you, I was interested, but, I knew he was running for the Senate. And I said, I don't do that sort of thing. You want to get someone who can really promote your career. And I said, I have to really get excited about a topic. He says, that's right, you don't know a thing about me. He said, you eat and I'll talk. And after a half hour, I was convinced he had a story. And so he's Northern Cheyenne. The night horse comes from the name Black Horse. It's the same word in the Cheyenne language. And that was his ancestor who was that little bighorn. And so, anyhow, he was a Korean War veteran. And as we traveled around and I'd tell him stories I'd heard here or there. He said, we really need a book about Indians in the military. He says, how about making that your next assignment? So I did. And that's why we ended up with warriors in uniform. And the stories are just amazing. And as Kevin mentioned, most people, non-Indians, have no clue that Indians were in the military. They grew up on these John Wayne movies where the Indians were the enemy, and they were in our path of expansion. And so, and part of the problem for the Indians is that they don't boast, they don't brag. You have to pull their stories out of them. For example, one of the people in the book is Vernon Sudol, Kiowa. He'd been in Vietnam, Korea, and somebody gave me his name, and I got in touch with him, and we made a couple phone calls, and then we talked more and more. And his daughter is now on this advisory committee that we've put together. And when she came to town and she met me, he said, "We are so grateful that you got interested and you called Dad, because we were sitting in the kitchen when he talked to you, and he told you stories we had never heard before. And now he's since dead." And so these are the kinds of things that are out there. The stories are there, but they're not recorded. And of course, you're probably aware the Library of Congress has had this oral history program for veterans. And they've been collecting military stories. And I had friends at the Library of Congress. I went and chatted with these people, and just when Kevin called me in to set this up, I thought we ought to start collecting stories and documenting them. And well, those people were delighted to hear that we had this program, because while they've collected thousands of stories, they had very few from Indians, because Indians don't tell these stories. And so now we formed a partnership with them, and so the stories will get collected and saved in 2 depositories here and at the Library of Congress. And again, my book was done about 8 years ago, and now since this project has begun, there's so many more stories coming. And as Kevin said, we've been going around listening to stories, and what's generally when we're in a meeting with the different groups, we have 30, 40 veterans show up, and we have a microphone, and each one gets up and talks and says when they were in, what they did, what do they think about the memorial. What has profoundly impacted me is how emotional so many of these veterans get. Some of them actually start crying as they talk about their service and the idea that there is going to finally be a memorial that recognizes their service. And it's important, not just here, but internationally. So for one story, well, I'll tell you 2 stories. The spirituality that we're talking about. One of our committee members is a Gold Star mother, Chippewa up in Upper Michigan, and she has 3 sons. They became SEALs. One was killed in Afghanistan, and he was in that helicopter that crashed. 17 SEALs were on that helicopter, and they all died. And it was the worst tragedy for SEALs in military history, our history. So anyhow, here are these 17 SEALs. One is her son, and she tells me the story that when they buried one of the Indian boys out west, his father called that night to tell her that, well, we buried my son, but the most unusual thing occurred. We counted 17 eagles circling overhead as we buried him. And again, the connection between our world and another world. Then the other story we picked up, I was visiting with the Comanches, Kiowas, and we had the usual meeting. The people got up and talked, and one was a woman who got up, and she said, "I'm a colonel in the United States Army right as we speak." And she said, "I want you to know that I'm a full blood." So she said, "I'm 1/4 Kiowa, 1/4 Comanche, 1/4 Delaware, and 1/4 Apache." And she said, "I went over to Afghanistan, and I was in a combat unit. And of course, even just realize that here's a woman in Afghanistan leading soldiers, which is again almost a cultural non sequitur. And of course, she attracted a lot of attention wherever she went. And of course, she had Afghan interpreters for her. So she said, we went into this village, and people gathered around, and they said, they want to know, who are you? And she said, well, I'm an American. And there was a little silence, and then they said, no, no, who are your parents? And then she realized they wanted to know her ethnicity. So she said, well, tell them I'm an Indian. And the interpreter said, Indian. Right away they start shouting, India, India. And no, no, she said, I'm an American Indian. Oh, okay, so the one interpreter kind of got the idea, and he said, she's a red American. Ah, a tribal person. So then the next question was, what tribe are you? And so she says, well, you know, I'm Comanche, I'm Kiowa, I'm Delaware. And then she said, I'm Apache. And right away they start shouting, Geronimo, Geronimo, John Wayne, John Wayne. And it shows the impact our movies have overseas, of course. And then there's silence, and then the man says, through the interpreter, we are puzzled. How can you be a red American? We heard that the Americans had killed all their red people. And as she said that, she just started sobbing. And she said, here I am, an American Indian fighting for this country, and people in the world don't even know we still exist. And again, that's why this memorial is so profoundly important. We're now going to not advertise just for the United States, but for the world. People are going to be aware that we honor our veterans and our Native veterans, and they are an important part of our history, and it's going to be an ongoing story. And so that's why I think we're so pleased that finally we're getting this off the ground. I hope we raised the money. I think we'll be able to. It certainly sounds like it. Everywhere I go, people get so excited, and they all want to know. First of all, the reality is most non-Indians, as Kevin said, is they can't believe Indians are this patriotic because they all know how they've been treated in this country. And I get that everywhere. And of course, all you have to say is these are warrior people who are protecting their families, and they're taking the white folks along for the ride, but they're here to protect this country and their homeland. Thank you very much.
So it is like that everywhere we go. We hear another story that just kind of blows you away from these veterans. And also, as Herman pointed out, they are very humble. We were talking to some descendants of code talker families, and in many cases, mine, for example. I had no idea. I knew that my grandfather and his brother were soldiers, but I didn't know that he was a code talker as well, a Pawnee code talker. And so I was asking, well, why didn't he ever tell us that? And my uncle said, because he was told that it was a secret. And so they thought they weren't allowed to talk about it, even long after they had been released from the service. But there's the usual reluctance of veterans to talk about, some very terrible things that they experienced. But you add to that the humility that these fellows, men and women, bring to their story, and it becomes very compelling when they finally do reveal some of what they experience. So that is our briefing. If anyone would like to make a comment or ask a question, we're certainly open to that. Yeah.
I'm just curious about something. Use the microphone, please. Oh. Well, I'm curious. You mentioned that it is hard to tell these stories, and it brings up a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings, and it's really a gift to us to be able to hear these. So I'm wondering, what kind of protocols does the museum actually implement in order to get these stories back? Because it takes a lot from people.
If we were going to actually collect them, the protocols would be very different. When we're in a public setting, as we are at these meetings, and they just stand and start telling their story. We don't have any particular protocol associated with that. But as we collect oral histories, we would do it very differently and try to find. We would ask, what is the appropriate way to ask for these stories? Yeah, good question. And we're going to have these veterans, this Veteran Advisory Committee will outlive the development of the memorial. We're always going to need some advice on things will come up with relation to this memorial that we can't anticipate right now. And we need a source of ready expertise on how to think about these things. So, like I said, it becomes a permanent project of the museum, and it'll always be a part of what we do here. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up, and thank you especially for being here today. Appreciate it. And like I said, we do have an email address specially devoted to receiving communications about this project. Rebecca Troutman is our project coordinator. Betsy Gordon is our project manager. Don't ask me to tell you what the difference between those things are. They know what the difference is, and that's what really matters. So feel free to reach out to them, and thank you for being here today.